The morning sun cast a golden hue over Fort Kearney, Nebraska. As Eliza Zimmerman stood alone on the steps of the white clapboard church, her wedding bouquet trembling in her gloved hands, the weight of public humiliation settling on her shoulders with each passing minute, her groom failed to appear. The year was 1875, and the promise of a new life with Harold Wilcox, the banker's son she'd been courting for nearly a year, had vanished like morning mist over the Platte River. The church bell had long since finished its cheerful announcement, now replaced by the hushed whispers of townsfolk who'd gathered to witness what was supposed to be the social event of the season. "Perhaps he's been delayed," Eliza's mother suggested, the tremor in her voice betraying her doubt as she patted her daughter's arm through layers of ivory satin. But Eliza knew better. The pounding in her chest told her what her heart refused to accept: she had been abandoned at the altar. Sheriff Mills approached, hat in hand, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Zimmerman, I'm afraid I've just received word." The stage carrying Mr. Wilcox was spotted heading east toward Omaha, not west of Fort Kearney. He was traveling with Miss Sullivan. The collective gasp from the gathered guests confirmed what Eliza had suspected when Lydia Sullivan, the milliner's pretty daughter, had sent her regrets for the wedding just yesterday. "I see," Eliza managed, her voice surprisingly steady despite the shattering of her heart. 22 years of proper upbringing wouldn't allow her to crumble in public, no matter how desperately she wanted to sink into the church steps and disappear. "Everyone," her father announced, his voice cracking with emotion, "it appears there will be no wedding today. Please join us at our home for the prepared refreshments nonetheless." As the crowd dispersed with pitying glances and whispered comments, Eliza remained frozen, unable to move from the spot where she'd expected to begin her new life. "Miss, the sun's mighty strong today. You shouldn't stay out here much longer." Eliza turned toward the unfamiliar voice, blinking away unshed tears to focus on the tall figure before her. Dusty boots, worn denim, a faded blue shirt, and a weathered Stetson shadowing a face bronzed by the prairie sun. This was no town dweller, this was a man who lived by the land and sky. "I'm perfectly fine," she replied automatically, though they both knew it was a lie. The stranger stepped closer, and Eliza noticed his eyes a striking blue that reminded her of the summer sky after a storm had cleared. "Name's Zachary Hawkins, madam. Most folks call me Zach." He gestured to the empty church behind her. "I reckon I'm late for the festivities." A bitter laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. "There are no festivities, Mr. Hawkins. The groom, it seems, had a change of heart." Zachary Hawkins studied her for a long moment, and Eliza resisted the urge to smooth her elaborate wedding gown or fix the veil that had begun to droop in the heat. "His loss," Zach said finally, with such simple conviction that Eliza almost believed him. She opened her mouth to respond when her father appeared at her elbow. "Eliza, darling, your mother is distraught. We should join the guests." "Mr. Zimmerman," Eliza said, finding her voice, "this is Mr. Hawkins." Her father gave the cowboy a cursory nod. "Good day to you, sir." "Actually," Zach said, removing his hat, "I've come about the ranch hand position at your place. Heard you were looking for experienced help with your herd." Samuel Zimmerman, one of the most successful cattle ranchers in the territory, assessed the cowboy with a critical eye. "You're a day early for the interview, but given today's circumstances, perhaps tomorrow would be better." "I understand, sir," Zach replied, replacing his hat. As her father turned to leave, Eliza found herself unwilling to follow, not yet ready to face the pity awaiting her at the reception that was now merely a consolation gathering. "Mr. Hawkins," she said impulsively, "would you escort me home? I find I need some fresh air before joining the others." Her father frowned. "Eliza, that's hardly—" "Please, father," she interrupted, something she rarely did. "Just a short walk. I'll arrive before the cake is cut." Perhaps it was the unusual firmness in her voice, or maybe the events of the day had left her father too tired to argue, but he reluctantly nodded. "Very well. Mr. Hawkins, I expect you to deliver my daughter to our door within 20 minutes. Zach nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir." As her father walked away, Eliza realized she was still clutching her wedding bouquet, white roses and baby's breath bound with satin ribbon. With a sudden, decisive motion, she thrust it toward Zach. "Would you dispose of this for me? I find I have no use for it." Instead of taking it, Zach tilted his head. "Seems a shame to waste something so pretty. Maybe you could press one of those flowers, keep it as a reminder." "A reminder of what, precisely? My humiliation?" "No, madam," he said, his voice low and steady. "A reminder that you survived today. That you're still standing when most folks would have crumbled." Eliza blinked, surprised by his insight. "You don't know me, Mr. Hawkins." "No," he agreed with a small smile, "but I know strength when I see it. Shall we?" He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Eliza placed her gloved hand in the crook of his elbow. As they walked down the church steps and onto the dusty main street of Fort Kearney, Eliza was acutely aware of the stares from townsfolk who had witnessed her abandonment. The whispers followed them like shadows. "Pay them no mind," Zach murmured. "They'll find something new to gossip about by week's end." "And until then?" Eliza asked, her voice wavering slightly. "Until then, you hold your head high. You've done nothing wrong." They walked in silence for a few minutes, the sound of their footsteps mingling with distant piano music from the saloon and the occasional whinny of horses tied at hitching posts. "Where are you from, Mr. Hawkins?" Eliza asked, desperate for conversation that didn't involve her failed wedding. "All over," he replied. "Born in Missouri, raised mostly in Kansas, spent time in Colorado, Wyoming, Texas. Been working cattle drives for the last 8 years. And what brings you to Fort Kearney?" Zach's stride faltered slightly. "Time for a change. Wanted to put down roots somewhere." There was more to his story, Eliza could tell, but she didn't press. She had enough secrets of her own. "The Zimmerman ranch is the largest in these parts," she said instead. "Father treats his men fairly, but he demands hard work. I'm no stranger to hard work, Miss Zimmerman." They rounded the corner onto Maple Street, where the Zimmerman home stood, a stately 2-story house with a wide porch and carefully tended garden. Already, carriages lined the street, and the sounds of forced gaiety drifted from the open windows. Eliza stopped, suddenly unable to take another step. The thought of facing all those people, their pity, their curiosity, perhaps even their secret satisfaction that the rancher's daughter wasn't so special after all, was unbearable. "I can't," she whispered, hating the weakness in her voice. "I can't go in there." Zach studied the house, then glanced down at her. "Then don't. Excuse me, don't go in," he said simply. "Not yet anyway, let's walk a bit more." "But father said 20 minutes, Zach finished for her. "We've only used about 8, come on." He gently steered her toward a small public garden across the street, where a bench sat beneath an old cottonwood tree. They sat in silence, Eliza still clutching her bouquet, now slightly wilted in the summer heat. "You know," Zach said finally, "my ma always said that the good Lord works in mysterious ways. Maybe today wasn't a tragedy, maybe it was a rescue." Eliza turned to him, surprised. "A rescue?" "Yes, madam." "Think about it, you could have married that man, only to discover years later that he wasn't who you thought. Instead, you found out today, before you made vows you can't take back." His words struck her with unexpected force. Harold had always been charming, always said the right things, but there had been moments, brief flashes, when his mask slipped that had given her pause. The way he spoke to servants when he thought no one important was listening. His dismissive attitude toward her ideas for the future. The casual cruelty he sometimes displayed toward animals. "Perhaps you're right, Mr. Hawkins," she said softly, "though it doesn't make the humiliation any easier to bear." "No, I reckon it doesn't." He looked at her directly. "But humiliation fades. Bad marriages don't." Before she could respond, the church bell tolled the hour, reminding her that she couldn't hide forever. "I should go in," she said reluctantly. Zach nodded, rising to his feet and offering his hand. "Yes, madam." As they crossed the street toward the Zimmerman home, Eliza noticed a commotion at the front door. Harold's father, Augustus Wilcox, was arguing with her father, his face flushed with either anger or embarrassment. "This is outrageous, Samuel. My son would never. Your son was seen boarding the eastbound stage with Lydia Sullivan, Augustus. The facts speak for themselves." Augustus Wilcox drew himself up, his banking fortune giving him the confidence to stand toe-to-toe with the rancher. "Perhaps your daughter gave him cause to look elsewhere. Harold has always been particular about, choose your next words carefully," Samuel Zimmerman warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Eliza's steps faltered, and Zach's hand moved to her elbow, steadying her. "I should intervene," she murmured. "Or," Zach suggested, "we could slip around back, avoid the whole scene." The idea was tempting more than tempting. Eliza hesitated only a moment before nodding. "The kitchen entrance is this way." They circled the house, passing through the garden gate and approaching the back door. Eliza was reaching for the handle when it swung open, revealing her mother's anxious face. "Eliza, where have you been?" "Everyone is," she stopped short, noticing Zach. "Who is this, Mr. Hawkins' mother?" "He's here about the ranch hand position. Father asked him to escort me home." Margaret Zimmerman's eyes narrowed slightly, but she stepped aside. "Well, come in, both of you. Mr. Wilcox is causing quite a scene in the front parlor." The kitchen was blessedly empty, the staff all occupied with serving the unexpected consolation reception. Eliza moved to the basin in the corner, removing her gloves to splash cool water on her face. "Mr. Hawkins, thank you for your escort," she said formally, aware of her mother's watchful gaze. "I'm sure you have other matters to attend to." Zach nodded, understanding her dismissal. "I'll call tomorrow about the position if that's all right, madam." "Yes, that would be fine." Father usually conducts interviews after breakfast. As he turned to leave, the kitchen door burst open again, and Harold's mother, Beatrice Wilcox, stormed in, her face a mask of indignation. "There you are," she exclaimed, pointing a finger at Eliza. "How dare you spread such vicious lies about my son?" Eliza straightened, water still dripping from her chin. "I've spread no lies, Mrs. Wilcox. The sheriff himself confirmed that Harold left on the eastbound stage." "With his cousin," Beatrice retorted. "Lydia Sullivan is his second cousin, you foolish girl. They're traveling to Omaha for his grandmother's illness. Harold sent a telegram this morning explaining the emergency." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. "What? Show her, Margaret," Beatrice demanded, turning to Eliza's mother. With trembling hands, Margaret Zimmerman extracted a crumpled telegram from her pocket and handed it to Eliza. "Urgent stop, grandmother gravely ill, stop. Must travel to Omaha, immediately stop, Lydia accompanying as family, stop, deepest apologies for wedding delay, stop, will return in 3 days' time, stop, love, Harold." The telegraph operator delivered it just as the ceremony was to begin, Margaret explained softly. "In the confusion, I forgot to tell you." Eliza stared at the paper, her mind racing. If Harold had truly been called away by family emergency, then she wasn't abandoned, merely delayed. But something didn't sit right. Sheriff Mills had seemed so certain. "The sheriff said," she began. "Mills is a fool," Augustus Wilcox pronounced, appearing in the doorway with Samuel Zimmerman close behind. "Always has been, jumping to conclusions based on town gossip." Samuel moved to his daughter's side. "Eliza, I think perhaps Mrs. Wilcox deserves an apology for the misunderstanding." Eliza looked from her father to the Wilcoxes, then to the telegram in her hand. A strange calm settled over her. "No," she said quietly. "I beg your pardon." Her father asked, clearly shocked. "I said no." Eliza lifted her chin. "I won't apologize for a situation I didn't create." If Harold was truly called away by emergency, he could have come to tell me himself before departing. He could have sent the telegram yesterday, when he surely knew of his grandmother's condition. Instead, he chose to leave without a word, allowing me to stand alone at the altar. Augustus Wilcox's face darkened. "Now see here, young lady—" "No, Mr. Wilcox, you see here," Eliza interrupted, surprising even herself with her boldness. "Your son has treated me with disrespect today, emergency or not. I deserve better than that." A tense silence filled the kitchen. Eliza was suddenly aware of Zach still standing by the door, witnessing the entire exchange. "Well," Beatrice Wilcox finally said, her voice brittle, "I can see that Harold was right about your temperament. Perhaps this delay is for the best. It gives you both time to reconsider whether you're truly suited." Without waiting for a response, she swept from the room, her husband following after throwing a dark look at the Zimmermans. As the door swung shut behind them, Eliza's knees finally gave way, and she sank onto a kitchen chair. Her parents exchanged worried glances. "Eliza," her father began, "perhaps you spoke hastily. The Wilcox connection would be advantageous for Samuel," Margaret cut in sharply. "Not now," he sighed, nodding. "Yes, you're right. Eliza, why don't you go upstairs and rest? Your mother will make your excuses to the guests." Eliza nodded numbly, rising from the chair. As she moved toward the stairs, she realized Zach was still there, watching the scene unfold with those keen blue eyes. "Mr. Hawkins," Samuel said, noticing him as well, "I believe we said tomorrow for the interview." "Yes, sir," Zach replied, placing his hat on his head. "I'll come by after breakfast." His eyes met Eliza's briefly. "Miss Zimmerman, Mr. Hawkins," she replied softly. As he left through the back door, Eliza couldn't help but feel that something significant had shifted in her world. Something beyond the chaos of the failed wedding. Climbing the stairs to her bedroom, she closed the door behind her and finally allowed the tears to fall, not for Harold, she realized with surprise, but for the certainty she'd lost, the future that now seemed to hover in an uncertain fog. Outside her window, she could just make out Zachary Hawkins' tall figure walking down the lane, his stride steady and unhurried. When he reached the main road, he paused, looking back at the house for a long moment before continuing on his way. Eliza watched until he disappeared from sight, wondering why the sight of a stranger brought her more comfort than thoughts of her absent fiancé. 3 days passed with no word from Harold. The telegram announcing his return remained unanswered, and the Wilcoxes had become conspicuously scarce around town. Rumors flew Harold and Lydia had eloped to Canada. The grandmother's story was a fabrication. Augustus Wilcox's bank was in financial trouble, and Harold had fled with the remaining assets. Eliza threw herself into work at the ranch, spending long hours in the saddle alongside the cowhands, much to her mother's dismay. It was during these rides that she occasionally crossed paths with Zachary Hawkins, who had indeed secured the position on her father's ranch. On the morning of the fourth day, Eliza was checking fence lines in the north pasture when she spotted Zach repairing a broken section. She'd been avoiding direct contact with him, embarrassed by the scene he'd witnessed in her kitchen. "Miss Zimmerman," he called, touching the brim of his hat as she approached. "Mr. Hawkins," she replied, reining in her mare. "Father speaks highly of your work. Just doing what I was hired for, madam." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of her horse pawing at the ground. "Any word from your intended?" Zach asked finally, his eyes on the fence post he was setting. "No," Eliza admitted. "And I'm beginning to think there won't be." Zach nodded as if he'd expected as much. "Town's full of talk." "I imagine it is." She sighed, dismounting to stretch her legs. "What's the consensus? Am I the jilted bride or the shrew who drove him away?" "Neither," Zach said, looking up at her directly. "Most folks are saying you're better off. Seems Mr. Wilcox had a reputation that went beyond Fort Kearney." "What do you mean?" Zach hesitated. "Not my place to spread gossip, Miss Zimmerman. Please," she said, stepping closer. "I need to know." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Word is, he left a string of broken engagements across Nebraska. Promises made, then convenient emergencies arising just before the wedding day. Sheriff Mills received a telegram yesterday from the marshal in Omaha. Seems Harold Wilcox and Lydia Sullivan were seen boarding a train to Chicago, and they weren't acting like cousins." Eliza felt a strange mixture of hurt and relief wash over her. "So it was all a lie." "Appears so." She turned away, gazing across the rolling prairie that had been her home all her life. "I should have known. There were signs." "Don't blame yourself," Zach said quietly. "Men like that are practiced at deception." She looked back at him, curious. "You seem to know a great deal about such things, Mr. Hawkins." A shadow crossed his face. "Had a sister who fell for a man like that. She wasn't as fortunate as you, ended up married to him for 3 years before she could get away." "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly. He shrugged, returning to his work. "Life teaches hard lessons sometimes." They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, companionable rather than awkward. Eliza watched him work, noticing the efficient movements of his hands, the way the muscles in his forearms flexed as he secured the wire to the post. "Would you join us for supper tonight, Mr. Hawkins?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself as much as him. He looked up, eyebrows raised. "Supper at the main house?" "Yes. Father often invites the foreman to dine with us. I think he'd like to hear more about your experience with the cattle drives." Zach hesitated. "Don't think your mother would approve." "Mother doesn't approve of most things I do these days," Eliza said with a small smile. "But I'm 22 years old, and I believe I'm entitled to invite a friend to dine at my father's table." The word friend hung between them, neither quite acknowledging the strange bond that had formed the day of the failed wedding. "In that case," Zach said finally, "I'd be honored, Miss Zimmerman." "Eliza," she corrected him. "If we're to be friends, you should call me Eliza." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip a beat. "Eliza, then, and I'm Zach." She nodded, remounting her horse. "Dinner is at 6, Zach. Don't be late." As she rode away, Eliza felt lighter than she had in days, perhaps even in months. Harold's betrayal still stung, but the pain was already beginning to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism about what the future might hold. Behind her, Zach watched her go, his hammer forgotten in his hand. That evening, promptly at 6 o'clock, Zachary Hawkins arrived at the main house. Dressed in the cleanest clothes, he owned a white shirt, black vest, and dark trousers that had seen better days but were neatly pressed. He'd even trimmed his beard and slicked back his dark hair. Margaret Zimmerman's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline when Eliza led him into the dining room, but Samuel seemed pleased to have another man at the table. "Hawkins, glad you could join us. Sit, sit. Mary's made her famous pot roast tonight." Dinner conversation flowed more easily than Eliza had anticipated. Zach spoke intelligently about cattle markets, new breeding techniques, and the changing landscape of ranching in the West. He listened attentively when Samuel discussed his plans for expanding the ranch's operations, and even Margaret seemed grudgingly impressed by his manners. "Where did you learn about Hereford cattle, Mr. Hawkins?" Samuel asked, refilling Zach's coffee cup. "Most cowhands I know couldn't tell a Hereford from a Longhorn if their lives depended on it. My grandfather ran a small breeding operation in Missouri," Zach explained. "Nothing like your spread, but enough to teach me the basics. When he passed, the land went to my uncle. I've been working to save enough to start my own place someday." "Admirable goal," Samuel nodded. "Land's not cheap, but a man who understands breeding stock like you do could do well." "Thank you, sir." Eliza watched the exchange with interest, seeing her father's growing respect for the cowboy. When the men moved to the porch after dinner to smoke, she helped her mother clear the table, waiting for the inevitable commentary. "He's quite presentable for a ranch hand," Margaret said finally, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes, he is," Eliza agreed, keeping her voice equally measured. "Your father seems taken with him. Father appreciates competence." Margaret paused in her work, studying her daughter. "Eliza, while I understand your disappointment with Harold, I hope you're not developing an interest in Mr. Hawkins simply out of spite." "Mother!" Eliza exclaimed, genuinely shocked. "I've invited him to dinner as a friend. Nothing more." Margaret murmured, unconvinced. "Well, just remember your position. The daughter of Samuel Zimmerman has certain obligations to uphold the family name regardless of recent events." Eliza bit back a retort, knowing it would only lead to an argument. Instead, she finished drying the dishes in silence, her thoughts turning to Zach and the ease she felt in his presence, an ease she'd never quite experienced with Harold, despite their year-long courtship. Later, as Zach prepared to leave, Eliza walked him to the edge of the porch, away from her father's earshot. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "I think you've won Father over completely with your talk of Herefords and breeding lines." Zach smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Your father's a good man, knows his business. And my mother, did she intimidate you terribly?" "Let's just say I'm glad looks can't actually kill," he replied with a chuckle. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the evening breeze carrying the scent of prairie grass and distant rain. "I've been thinking," Eliza said suddenly, "about what you said at the church, about how maybe I was rescued rather than abandoned. And I think perhaps you were right." She looked up at him, the porch lantern casting a warm glow over his features. "Harold was not who I thought he was. Maybe I never really knew him at all." Zach nodded slowly. "People show you who they truly are in moments of crisis. Remember that." "Is that what you're doing, Mr. Hawkins? Showing me who you truly are?" His eyes met hers, serious now. "I try to be the same man every day, Eliza." "What you see is what you get." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. Before she could respond, Samuel called from the doorway. "Hawkins, early start tomorrow. We're moving the herd to the south pasture." "Yes, sir," Zach called back, then turned to Eliza. "Thank you for dinner, Miss Zimmerman." She smiled at his return to formality in her father's presence. "You're welcome, Mr. Hawkins. Good night." As she watched him walk toward the bunkhouse, Eliza realized with a start that for the first time in days, she hadn't thought about Harold Wilcox for hours. The next 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that brought unexpected comfort to Eliza. Each morning, she rode out with the ranch hands, helping with the daily tasks of running the Zimmerman empire. Samuel, seeing his daughter's determination to learn the business, began including her in decisions he'd previously kept to himself. And each day, Eliza found herself seeking out Zachary Hawkins, whether to ask his opinion on a sick calf or to share a quick lunch in the shade of an old oak tree. Their conversations ranged from ranch business to books they'd read, to dreams of the future. She learned that Zach had taught himself to read by lamplight after long days on cattle drives, that he'd once traveled as far south as Mexico, and that he could name every constellation in the night sky. "My pa was obsessed with the stars," he explained one evening as they sat on the porch steps after dinner, a habit that had developed despite Margaret's thinly veiled disapproval. Said a man who could read the sky would never truly be lost. Was he right? Eliza asked, gazing up at the vast expanse above them. "Mostly," Zach admitted with a smile. "Though there was that one time in the Badlands when even the stars couldn't help me find my way out of a box canyon." She laughed, then sobered. "Do you miss him? Your father?" "Every day," Zach said softly. "Lost him and Ma both to influenza when I was 18. Been on my own since then." Eliza reached out impulsively, placing her hand over his. "I'm sorry." He turned his hand, their palms meeting, fingers intertwining as if they'd done this 100 times before. "Life goes on. You adapt or you break." They sat in silence, hands joined, until the kitchen door opened and Margaret called Eliza inside. It was the following Sunday when everything changed. The Zimmerman family was preparing for church when Sheriff Mills arrived at their door, his expression grim. "Samuel, there's been trouble. Augustus Wilcox collapsed at the bank yesterday afternoon. Doc says it was his heart." "Good Lord," Samuel muttered. "Is he?" "He's alive, but barely." The bank's in an uproar. Seems Harold emptied the accounts before he disappeared. The bank's essentially bankrupt, Eliza gasped. "But that would mean—" "Half the town's savings gone," Mills confirmed. "Including most of your father's operating capital, I'd wager." Samuel's face had gone pale. "How much, John? How much did they take?" The sheriff removed his hat. "Near as they can figure, close to $50,000. The number hung in the air like a thundercloud. Eliza knew that her father kept significant funds at Wilcox Bank to manage the ranch's payroll and expenses. "Samuel." Margaret's voice trembled. "What does this mean for us?" He straightened his shoulders. "It means we have some hard decisions ahead, but the Zimmerman ranch isn't finished, not by a long shot." The church service that morning was subdued, with whispered conversations replacing the usual socializing. The Wilcox family pew sat empty, Beatrice presumably at her husband's bedside. As they left the church, Eliza noticed Zach standing across the street, dressed in his Sunday best, watching the congregation disperse. Their eyes met, and he gave a small nod before turning away. That afternoon, Samuel called a meeting of all the ranch hands. Standing on the porch of the main house, he explained the situation without mincing words. "Most of you know by now that Wilcox Bank has failed. What you may not know is that much of this ranch's operating capital was deposited there. We're not ruined, but we are in a difficult position." Murmurs ran through the assembled men. "I can't promise there won't be changes," Samuel continued. "Some of you may need to seek employment elsewhere. Those who stay will have to accept delayed wages until we can sell enough cattle to stabilize our position." Eliza stood behind her father, watching the faces of men who had worked the Zimmerman land for years. Some looked worried, others resigned, a few angry. "Anyone who wishes to leave will receive a letter of recommendation, and whatever wages I can scrape together," Samuel finished. "I won't hold it against you. These are extraordinary circumstances. As the men dispersed to discuss their options, Eliza noticed Zach standing apart, his expression thoughtful. "What will you do?" she asked, approaching him. He turned, studying her face. "You look worried. Wouldn't you be? Father could lose everything." Zach shook his head. "Your father's too smart for that. He'll find a way through this." "You didn't answer my question," Eliza pressed. "Will you stay or go?" "That depends," he said, his voice low. "On what?" "On whether I'm needed here." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Before she could respond, her father called her name. "We'll talk later," Zach said, touching his hat before walking toward the bunkhouse. That evening, Samuel closeted himself in his study with ledgers and papers spread across his desk. When he finally emerged, his face was drawn but determined. "We'll need to sell the north section," he told Margaret and Eliza as they sat in the parlor, "and at least half the breeding stock." "Samuel, no," Margaret protested. "That land has been in your family for 2 generations. We don't have a choice, Margaret. It's that or lose everything." Eliza's mind raced. "Father, what about the cattle drive? You mentioned sending a herd to Cheyenne next month. If we could get them there sooner." "The herd isn't ready," Samuel sighed. "And we don't have enough hands to manage a drive right now. Half the men requested their papers today." "What if," Eliza said slowly, an idea forming, "what if we combined the drive with selling the north section? Drive the cattle to Cheyenne, sell them for the best price possible, and while there, meet with that land speculator who's been writing to you, the one interested in our northern water rights." Samuel stared at his daughter, considering. "It might work. But I can't leave now, not with everything in chaos, and I can't send the foreman. Johnson's wife is due any day." "I could go," Eliza suggested, her heart racing at her own boldness. "Absolutely not," Margaret exclaimed. "A young woman alone on a cattle drive, it's unthinkable." "I wouldn't be alone, Mother. I'd have the ranch hands with me." "Which makes it even more inappropriate," Margaret retorted. Samuel held up a hand, silencing both women. "Eliza, your mother's right. It's too dangerous. And after the Harold fiasco, your reputation is already my reputation." Eliza interrupted, anger flaring. "I was the one left at the altar, Father. I was the victim of Harold's deception, and now our entire family may lose everything because of him. I think my reputation is the least of our concerns." A tense silence followed her outburst. "I could go with her." All 3 Zimmermans turned to find Zachary Hawkins standing in the doorway, his expression serious. "Mr. Hawkins," Samuel began, frowning, "this is a private family discussion." "Yes, sir, and I apologize for interrupting. But I couldn't help overhearing, and I have a proposition that might help." Samuel studied him for a moment, then gestured for him to continue. "I've led 6 cattle drives to Cheyenne," Zach explained. "I know the trails, the watering holes, the danger spots. I also know which buyers pay fair prices and which ones will try to cheat you. If Miss Zimmerman is set on going, and it sounds like a good plan to me, I could accompany her as a guide and protector." "Out of the question," Margaret declared. "A single man and my unmarried daughter alone for weeks. The scandal would ruin her." "Not if they were married," Samuel said quietly. All eyes turned to him in shock. "Samuel," Margaret gasped. "Father," Eliza exclaimed simultaneously. He held up his hands, just thinking aloud, but it would solve several problems at once. Zach cleared his throat. "Mr. Zimmerman, while I respect your daughter greatly, I don't think it was merely a thought," Samuel interrupted, "though perhaps not my most practical one." He turned to Zach. "How many men would you need for the drive?" "Minimum of 6 if the herd's not too large. More would be better." Samuel nodded, thinking. "Johnson could spare 3 men who have done drives before. With you, that's 4. I could ask Peterson from the next ranch over if he'd lend 2 of his boys." That would work, Zach agreed. And Eliza, Margaret pressed. I still think she should go, Samuel said, surprising them all. Not as a drover, but as my representative to meet with the land speculator. She knows the north section better than anyone, and frankly, she has a better head for figures than I do. Eliza felt a surge of pride at her father's words. She would travel separately, of course, Samuel continued. By stagecoach, meeting the herd in Cheyenne, Mrs. Peterson could accompany her as a chaperone. Margaret still looked unhappy but seemed to recognize the practicality of the plan. And who would lead this drive? Surely not Mr. Hawkins, he's only been with us a few weeks. Zach has more experience with drives than any man on this ranch, Samuel replied, and I trust him. The simple statement seemed to settle something in the room. Eliza looked at Zach, who was watching her father with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Then it's decided, Samuel declared. Zach will lead the drive, departing in 3 days. Eliza and Mrs. Peterson will follow by stage a week later, arriving in Cheyenne in time to meet the buyers. As the plans were finalized, Eliza caught Zach's eye across the room. He gave her a slight nod, a promise that hung unspoken between them. Whatever happened in Cheyenne, they would face it together. The next 3 days passed in a flurry of activity. The cattle were rounded up, supplies gathered, and men selected for the drive. Samuel Peterson, a neighboring rancher who had known the Zimmermans for years, agreed to loan 2 of his most experienced hands and to allow his wife, Clara, to accompany Eliza on the stagecoach journey. The morning of departure dawned clear and cool, with a hint of autumn in the air despite the August date. Eliza rose early, dressing in a simple riding outfit to see the men off. The herd, nearly 200 head of prime beef cattle, was already gathered in the south pasture, milling restlessly as the drovers prepared for the long journey. Zach moved among the men, giving final instructions, his presence commanding despite his relatively short time at the ranch. Eliza approached as he finished speaking to Johnson, the foreman. Everything ready, Zach nodded, his eyes taking in her riding clothes. Planning to join us after all. Just to the river crossing, she replied. Father thought it would be good for morale if I saw you off properly. Your father's a wise man. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the activity around them. In the 3 weeks since Eliza's failed wedding, something had grown between them, an understanding, a connection that neither had put into words but both felt keenly. Be careful in Cheyenne, Zach said finally. It's rougher than Fort Kearney. Stay close to Mrs. Peterson. I can take care of myself, Eliza reminded him, but I appreciate your concern. He smiled, the expression warming his eyes. I know you can, still doesn't stop me from worrying. A call from one of the drovers interrupted them. It was time to move out. Zach whistled for his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding that came trotting over immediately. I'll see you in Cheyenne, he said, swinging into the saddle. In Cheyenne, Eliza confirmed. As the herd began to move, dust rising around the lowing cattle, Eliza mounted her own horse and rode alongside Zach at the head of the procession. They traveled in companionable silence until they reached the river, crossing several miles from the ranch. This is where I leave you, she said, reining in her mare. Zach nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. Eliza, he began, then hesitated. Yes. When this is all over, when we've saved the ranch and things settle down, there's something I'd like to discuss with you. Her heart quickened. What sort of something? The sort that might make your mother even more disapproving than she already is, he replied with a hint of a smile. Eliza laughed, the sound carrying over the river's gentle flow. In that case, Mr. Hawkins, I look forward to our discussion most eagerly. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, bringing it briefly to his lips in a gesture so unexpected that Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Until Cheyenne," he said softly, releasing her hand and turning his horse toward the waiting herd. Eliza watched until the dust cloud disappeared over the horizon, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched. The stagecoach journey to Cheyenne was both more grueling and more enlightening than Eliza had anticipated. Clara Peterson proved to be excellent company, a practical, no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had made the journey to Cheyenne several times before. "The trick is to bring your own food," she advised as they bumped along the rutted trail. "The stage stops serve slop they wouldn't feed to pigs back home." The other passengers, a traveling salesman, an elderly couple returning to their son's home in Laramie, and a quiet man who claimed to be a teacher, made for interesting, if cramped, company. Eliza learned more about the territories in those 5 days than she had in her entire life in Fort Kearny. They arrived in Cheyenne dusty, sore, and exhausted. The frontier town was larger and more developed than Eliza had expected, with proper streets, substantial buildings, and an air of permanent prosperity that many Western settlements lacked. "Coal and cattle," Clara explained as they checked into the Cheyenne Hotel. "That's what built this place. Your father's herd will fetch a good price here. The railroad takes the beef straight to Chicago." After washing away the travel dust and changing into a fresh dress, Eliza sent telegrams to her parents and to the land speculator, a Mr. James Hartley, who had expressed interest in the Zimmerman North section. Then she and Clara ventured out to explore the town. "The cattle drive should arrive within 2 days," Eliza said, consulting the schedule Zach had outlined before departing. Mr. Hawkins planned to graze them in the valley east of town while negotiations took place. "Smart man," Clara nodded. "Keeps the cattle from losing weight after the journey. A plumper cow fetches a better price." They were passing a busy saloon when a familiar voice called out, "Miss Zimmerman." Eliza turned to find Augustus Wilcox standing on the boardwalk, his face flushed with what appeared to be both surprise and alcohol. He looked terrible, unshaven, his clothes rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. "Mr. Wilcox," she replied coldly. "I was led to believe you were on your deathbed in Fort Kearny." He gave a bitter laugh. "As you can see, reports of my imminent demise were greatly exaggerated." His gaze darted nervously up and down the street. "What brings you to Cheyenne? Pursuing my wayward son?" "Hardly," Eliza scoffed. "I'm here on ranch business." "Ranch business? My dear girl, what could Samuel possibly—" He stopped, his eyes narrowing. "He's selling, isn't he? The bank failure has forced his hand." Eliza lifted her chin. "The Zimmerman ranch will survive your son's theft, Mr. Wilcox. Though I can't say the same for your reputation." Augustus stepped closer, his breath sour with whiskey. "You think you know everything, don't you? Little Miss Zimmerman, so high and mighty, you have no idea what Harold was running from, what we were all running from." "Mr. Wilcox," Clara interrupted firmly, "I believe you've had too much to drink. Good day to you." She took Eliza's arm, steering her away from the increasingly agitated man. "You'll regret your arrogance," Augustus called after them. "Mark my words, girl, this isn't over." Once they were safely around the corner, Clara released Eliza's arm. "What was that about? What did he mean? What Harold was running from?" Eliza shook her head, troubled. "I don't know. Father always said Augustus was honest to a fault. It was shocking when the bank failed. I never would have believed he was involved in Harold's theft." "Perhaps he wasn't," Clara suggested. "Not willingly, anyway." The encounter cast a pall over their explorations, and they returned to the hotel earlier than planned. As they passed the front desk, the clerk called out to Eliza, "Miss Zimmerman, telegram for you." Eliza accepted the envelope with a sense of foreboding, which only deepened when she read the brief message. Cattle drive attacked, stop 3 men wounded, stop herd scattered, stop Hawkins missing, stop search parties formed, stop. Will update, stop Johnson. Her hands trembled as she passed the telegram to Clara. "Zach," she whispered. "He's missing." Clara read the message, her expression grave. "We need more information. Let's find the telegraph office and send a response." The next hours passed in a blur of anxiety. Eliza sent multiple telegrams, first to Johnson at the last known location of the drive, then to her father with news of the attack. The responses were frustratingly vague. Johnson reported that masked riders had ambushed the herd at dawn, shooting wildly and scattering the cattle. In the chaos, Zach had pursued several of the attackers and hadn't returned. "It doesn't make sense," Eliza said, pacing their hotel room that evening. "Cattle rustling is common enough, but they didn't even try to steal the herd, just scatter it. And why would Zach chase after them alone?" "To identify them, perhaps," Clara suggested, "or to prevent them from returning." A knock at their door interrupted their discussion. Clara answered it cautiously, revealing a young boy in a telegraph uniform. "Message for Miss Zimmerman," he announced, holding out another envelope. Eliza tore it open, her heart racing. "Hawkins found, stop injured but alive, stop says attack planned, stop suspects Wilcox involvement, stop remaining cattle being gathered, stop estimate arrival, Cheyenne 2 days delayed, stop Johnson, thank God," Eliza breathed, sinking onto the bed. "He's alive." Clara read over her shoulder. "Wilcox involvement, that's a serious accusation. It fits with Augustus's strange behavior today," Eliza said slowly. "What if the bank failure wasn't just Harold's theft? What if there's more to the story? You should be careful," Clara warned. "If the Wilcoxes are truly behind the attack, they might not be pleased to find you in Cheyenne." Eliza straightened her shoulders. "I'm not hiding, Clara. If Augustus Wilcox thinks he can intimidate me or my family, he's sorely mistaken." Despite her brave words, Eliza took precautions over the next 2 days. She and Clara conducted their business meeting with Mr. Hartley about the north section, and visiting the cattle yards to arrange for the sale of the herd with careful attention to their surroundings. The meeting with Hartley went better than expected. The land speculator, representing a group of Eastern investors planning a railway spur line, offered a fair price for the water rights to the north section, while allowing the Zimmermans to retain grazing privileges. "This could actually work in our favor long term," Eliza told Clara as they left Hartley's office. "Father was concerned about overgrazing that section anyway, and now we'll have railway access directly from our property." As they turned onto the main street, Eliza spotted a familiar figure down the block, Harold Wilcox, emerging from a bank with a leather satchel clutched tightly under his arm. He hadn't seen her yet, his attention focused on hailing a passing carriage. Without thinking, Eliza strode toward him, ignoring Clara's warning hiss. "Harold Wilcox," he froze, then slowly turned, his handsome face registering first shock, then a calculated smile. "Eliza, what a surprise." "Is it?" "I rather think the surprise was mine, when you abandoned me at the altar and emptied your father's bank." Harold glanced around nervously, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It's not what you think, Eliza. I had no choice save your lies for someone who hasn't already seen through them," she snapped. "I know about the other engagements, Harold, the other women you've deceived. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" A flicker of genuine emotion, anger perhaps, or fear crossed his face before the smooth mask returned. "You always were clever, Eliza. It's what attracted me to you in the first place." He sighed dramatically. "I truly am sorry for the wedding. That wasn't part of the plan." "And what was the plan exactly?" To marry me, then disappear with my father's money as well, Harold's smile faltered. Your father's money was already gone, Eliza. The bank was insolvent months before I left. Father's investments in the railway spur failed when Hartley's group changed their proposed route. He laughed bitterly. Ironic that you're likely here to sell him the very land that ruined us. Eliza stared at him, pieces falling into place. So you stole what was left and ran. I took what was mine, Harold corrected. My inheritance before the creditors could claim it. Father agreed it was his idea, in fact. One of us had to get away clean. And the attack on our cattle drive, Eliza demanded. Was that part of your plan too? For the first time, Harold looked genuinely confused. Attack? What are you talking about? Before Eliza could respond, Clara appeared at her side, gripping her arm urgently. Eliza, we need to go now. Following Clara's gaze, Eliza saw Augustus Wilcox approaching with two rough-looking men. Harold spotted them too, his face draining of color. Go, he hissed to Eliza. My father isn't. He's not himself these days. Without waiting for a response, Harold turned and ran in the opposite direction, clutching his satchel tightly. Eliza, please, Clara urged, pulling her toward a nearby shop. They ducked inside just as Augustus and his companions reached the spot where they'd been standing. Through the window, Eliza watched as Augustus scanned the street, his expression thunderous, before continuing in the direction Harold had fled. What was that about? She whispered to Clara. The older woman shook her head. I don't know, but I've seen men like those two before. They're not bankers or businessmen, they're hired muscle. That evening, Eliza wrote a detailed account of the day's events in a letter to her father, including her conversation with Harold and the strange behavior of Augustus Wilcox. As she sealed the envelope, a commotion in the street below their hotel room drew her to the window. The cattle drive had arrived. Forgetting propriety, Eliza grabbed her shawl and rushed downstairs, Clara following close behind. The street was filled with dust and noise as the reduced herd Eliza estimated they'd lost about a quarter of the cattle was guided toward the stockyards at the edge of town. And there, at the head of the procession, was Zachary Hawkins. Even from a distance, Eliza could see he was injured. A bandage wrapped his left arm and he rode slightly slumped in the saddle. But he was alive, and the sight of him sent a flood of relief through her that was so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. She pushed through the gathering crowd, heedless of the dust and the curious stares. Zach. He turned at her voice, his weary face lighting up. Without hesitation, he swung down from his horse and strode toward her, ignoring the calls of the other drovers. They met in the middle of the street, oblivious to the spectacle they were creating. You're hurt, Eliza said, her eyes taking in the bandage, the bruise on his jaw, the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. I'll live, he replied simply, his gaze never leaving her face. You're a sight for sore eyes, Eliza Zimmerman. Without thinking, she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his dusty shirt. His good arm came around her, holding her tight against him as if he'd never let go. I thought I'd lost you, she whispered against his chest. His hand moved to her hair, cradling her head gently. Not a chance. I made you a promise, remember, in Cheyenne. She looked up at him, suddenly aware of the crowd watching them, of Clara's startled expression, of the impropriety of embracing a cowboy in the middle of the street, and in that moment she didn't care. I saw Harold, she said urgently. He's here in Cheyenne. And his father, something's wrong, Zach. He had men with him, dangerous-looking men. Zach's expression hardened. I know, they're the ones who attacked the drive. You're sure? He nodded grimly. I recognized one of them when I gave chase. He works for a man named Delaney, a loan shark from Omaha who's been moving west, buying up distressed properties and debts. Harold mentioned creditors, Eliza recalled. He said the bank was already insolvent before he left. That fits with what we found. Zach glanced around, noticing the attention they were attracting. We should talk somewhere private. Clara appeared beside them. The hotel dining room should be quiet this time of day. Mr. Hawkins, you look like you could use a hot meal. Zach smiled gratefully. Yes, madam. That and about a week's sleep. As they walked toward the hotel, Eliza kept close to Zach's side, unwilling to let him out of her sight. They settled in a quiet corner of the dining room, and while they waited for food to arrive, Zach explained what had happened during the drive. The attack came at dawn, just as we were breaking camp. 6 riders, faces covered, firing into the air to scatter the herd. Johnson and 2 others were wounded, but nothing serious. I recognized the leader's horse, a distinctive Appaloosa I'd seen at the livery in Fort Kearny. So you followed them, Eliza said, already knowing the answer. Zach nodded. Tracked them to a camp about 5 miles away. That's when I saw Augustus Wilcox with them, arguing with a man I know to be Matthew Delaney. I couldn't hear everything, but it was clear Wilcox owed Delaney money, a lot of money. And Delaney ordered the attack on our herd. That's my guess. Scatter the cattle, delay the sale, perhaps force your father to sell at a loss to Delaney's agents, no doubt. Clara frowned. But how would delaying the sale help Delaney collect from Wilcox? It wouldn't, Zach admitted. But if the Zimmerman ranch failed, Delaney could acquire it cheaply through foreclosure. The north section alone would be worth a fortune to the right buyer. Hartley's railway investors, Eliza realized. The same group whose route change apparently ruined the Wilcoxes in the first place. She shook her head. It's all connected. What happened after you spotted them? Clara asked. Zach's expression darkened. I was careless. One of Delaney's men caught me watching. They gave chase. I took a bullet in the arm but managed to lose them in the hills. By the time I made it back to our camp, Johnson had already organized search parties. And the herd, we recovered most of it. Lost about 50 head over a cliff in the initial stampede. The rest we rounded up within a day. Eliza reached across the table, placing her hand over his. I'm just glad you're alive. Their eyes met, a current of understanding passing between them that went beyond words. Clara cleared her throat delicately, reminding them of her presence. What do we do now? Eliza asked, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. If Delaney is as dangerous as you say, and if the Wilcoxes are involved with him, we complete our business and leave, Zach said firmly. Sell the cattle, finalize the deal with Hartley, and get out of Cheyenne as quickly as possible. Let the law handle Delaney and the Wilcoxes. I've already telegraphed the marshal, Clara added. He's aware of the situation. As they were finishing their meal, the hotel manager approached their table. Miss Zimmerman, another telegram for you. This one was from her father. Deal with Hartley approved. Stop sell cattle at fair price. Stop return home. Immediately stop sheriff investigating Wilcox connections. Stop be careful. Stop love father. Eliza passed the telegram to Zach, who nodded in agreement. We'll sell the cattle tomorrow. I know a buyer who'll give us a fair price without haggling. And I'll meet with Hartley to finalize the contract, Eliza added. We could be ready to leave by the day after tomorrow. I'll book our passage on the eastbound stage, Clara said, rising from the table. If you'll excuse me, I should send a telegram to my husband as well. As Clara left, Eliza and Zach found themselves alone, the dining room now empty save for a waiter clearing distant tables. You should rest, Eliza said, noticing how Zach's shoulders slumped with fatigue. You look exhausted. I am, he admitted, but there's something I need to say first. He leaned forward, his voice low and earnest. When I was out there, wounded and thinking I might not make it back, there was only one thing on my mind." "What was that?" Eliza whispered, though she thought she knew the answer. "You," he said simply. "The thought that I might not see you again was more painful than the bullet." Heat rushed to Eliza's cheeks. "Zach, I know it's too soon," he continued. "You were engaged to another man less than a month ago, and I'm just a cowboy with nothing to offer but myself." "But I need you to know I love you," Eliza interrupted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I think I have since that day at the church, when you told me I was strong when I felt anything but." Zach stared at her, his blue eyes wide with surprise, then softening with an emotion that made her heart race. "I love you too, Eliza Zimmerman," he said softly. "And when we get back to Fort Kearney, I'm going to properly court you with your father's permission, until you're absolutely certain that what you feel now isn't just gratitude or relief." She smiled, tears pricking at her eyes. "And if I'm already certain—" "Then," he replied, reaching across the table to take her hand, "we'll have a very short courtship." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the perfect weather for concluding their business in Cheyenne. Zach, despite his injury, rode with Johnson and the other drovers to the stockyards, where his contact, a buyer for a Chicago meatpacking company, was waiting to inspect the herd. Eliza, accompanied by Clara, met with James Hartley at his office to sign the final papers for the sale of the water rights to the North Section. The transaction went smoothly, with Hartley providing a bank draft for the agreed sum. "Your father drives a hard bargain, Miss Zimmerman," Hartley commented as they concluded their business. "But I believe this arrangement will benefit both our interests in the long term." "I agree, Mr. Hartley," Eliza replied, tucking the bank draft securely into her reticule. "The railway spur will bring prosperity to the entire region." As they left Hartley's office, Eliza felt a weight lift from her shoulders. With the cattle sale and the land deal, her father would have more than enough capital to weather the crisis caused by the Wilcox Bank failure. The Zimmerman ranch was saved. They were crossing the main street when Eliza spotted a commotion outside the marshal's office. A crowd had gathered, and at its center stood Augustus Wilcox, his hands bound behind him, being led up the steps by two deputies. "What's happening?" Eliza asked a bystander. "Wilcox is being arrested," the man replied eagerly. "Fraud, theft, conspiracy. They're saying he orchestrated a scheme to defraud depositors and investors across Nebraska." "And his son?" Eliza couldn't help asking. "Harold Wilcox," the man shrugged. "Haven't seen him. Word is he skipped town last night, headed for California." Eliza wasn't surprised. Harold had always taken the easy way out. They continued to the hotel, where they found Zach waiting in the lobby, his face alight with good news. "Sold the entire herd," he announced. "Premium price more than your father hoped for. Johnson's depositing the bank draft now." "The land deal went through as well," Eliza told him. "And Augustus Wilcox has been arrested." Zach's eyebrows rose. The marshal worked quickly. Too quickly for Harold, apparently. He's fled to California. "Good riddance," Clara muttered. "Now I've secured our places on tomorrow morning's stage. Mr. Hawkins, will you be traveling with us or with the drovers?" Zach glanced at Eliza, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, and he smiled. "With you, Mrs. Peterson, if there's room. Johnson and the boys can make their own way back. They've earned some time in town after the drive." That evening, they celebrated their success with a proper dinner in the hotel's dining room. Johnson and the other drovers joined them, their spirits high with the successful conclusion of their mission despite the earlier troubles. "To the Zimmerman ranch," Johnson proposed, raising his glass. "May it prosper for generations to come." "And to Mr. Hawkins," Eliza added, her eyes meeting Zach's across the table, without whom we might not have succeeded. The journey back to Fort Kearny seemed to pass in half the time of their outbound trip, perhaps because Eliza's heart was lighter, or perhaps because Zach's presence beside her made every mile a pleasure rather than an ordeal. They arrived home to find the Zimmerman ranch buzzing with activity. News of their success had preceded them, and Samuel had already begun implementing changes to secure the ranch's future. "Eliza," he called, striding down the porch steps as the stage pulled up. "Well done, my girl." He embraced her tightly, then shook Zach's hand with equal enthusiasm. "And you, Hawkins, Johnson's telegram said you were the hero of the hour." Zach ducked his head modestly. "Just doing my job, sir." "Well, your job seems to include saving my ranch and my daughter, so forgive me if I disagree," Samuel replied with a laugh. "Come inside, both of you. Margaret has prepared a welcome home feast." That evening, after dinner, Zach asked to speak with Samuel privately. Eliza waited nervously in the parlor with her mother, who had been remarkably civil to Zach since their return, perhaps because news of the Wilcox scandal had spread throughout the territory, making Eliza's narrow escape from marriage to Harold seem providential rather than embarrassing. When the men returned, Samuel's face was solemn but his eyes twinkled. "Eliza, Mr. Hawkins has something he wishes to discuss with you. Your mother and I will give you some privacy." As her parents left the room, Eliza turned to Zach, her heart racing. "What did you say to father?" "I asked his permission to court you properly," Zach replied, moving to stand before her. "And to present you with this." From his pocket, he withdrew a small silver ring with a simple blue stone that matched his eyes. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "Not fancy, but given with all the love in my heart." Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful, Zach. I'm not asking for your hand yet," he clarified. "That'll come when you're ready. This is a promise that I'll be here, that I'm not going anywhere, that when you decide you want forever, I'll be waiting." "Her groom never showed," Eliza whispered, looking up at him with shining eyes. "But a cowboy said, 'I'm here, and I'm not leaving.'" Zach smiled, taking her hand and slipping the ring onto her finger. "That's right, and I meant every word." Their courtship lasted through the autumn and winter, as the Zimmerman ranch recovered from the financial crisis and began to prosper once more. Zach proved himself invaluable to Samuel, introducing new breeding techniques and more efficient management systems that increased the ranch's productivity. By spring, when the prairie bloomed with wildflowers and new calves dotted the pastures, Eliza was certain of her heart. On a warm May evening, beneath the same cottonwood tree where they had sat the day of her failed wedding to Harold, Zach knelt and asked her to be his wife. Their wedding, held in the same church where Eliza had once been abandoned, was a joyous affair. The entire town turned out to see the rancher's daughter marry her cowboy, many secretly admitting that they made a far better match than Eliza and Harold ever had. As they exchanged vows, Eliza gazed up at Zach's face, no longer a stranger, but the man she knew better than herself, the man who had stood by her through crisis and triumph, the man who had promised to stay and had kept that promise. "I do," she said clearly, her voice carrying to the rafters of the small church. Later, as they danced at their wedding celebration, Zach pulled her close and whispered, "Happy Mrs. Hawkins." "More than I ever thought possible," Eliza replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in a strange way we owe Harold Wilcox a debt of gratitude. If he hadn't run out on you that day, we might never have met," Eliza finished for him. "Though I think we would have somehow. Some things are meant to be." Zach smiled, the expression lighting his blue eyes. "Like a cowboy and a rancher's daughter," Exactly like that, she agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him as the music played on around them. 5 years later, Eliza stood on the porch of their home, a comfortable house built on a corner of the Zimmerman property that Samuel had gifted them as a wedding present, watching Zach teach their 3-year-old son, Samuel, to ride his first pony. Beside her, their 1-year-old daughter, Mary, babbled happily in her arms. The ranch had not only recovered but thrived under the combined management of Samuel Zimmerman and Zachary Hawkins. The railway spur line had been completed the previous year, bringing new opportunities for shipping cattle and acquiring supplies. Harold Wilcox had never returned to Nebraska, though occasionally news of his exploits in California reached them. Augustus had served 2 years in prison before being released, a broken man who lived out his remaining days in a small cottage outside Fort Kearny, largely forgotten by the town he had once helped build. As Zach lifted little Samuel from the pony and set him on his shoulders, the boy's laughter floating across the yard, Eliza felt a contentment so complete it brought tears to her eyes. This was the life she was meant to have, not the one she had planned with Harold, but something far richer, far more authentic. Zach looked up, catching her gaze, and the smile he gave her still made her heart skip a beat. He strode toward the porch, their son bouncing happily on his shoulders. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" he asked, setting Samuel down to run after a butterfly. "Just how fortunate I am," Eliza replied, leaning into him as his arm came around her shoulders. "How one of the worst days of my life led to the best decision I ever made." Zach pressed a kiss to her temple. "Marrying me?" "No," she teased, looking up at him with a mischievous smile. "Letting you escort me home from the church that day." He laughed, the sound still her favorite in the world. "Best day's work I ever did." As the sun began to set over the Nebraska prairie, casting long shadows across the land that had shaped both their lives, Eliza thought of the frightened, humiliated young woman she had been, standing alone on the church steps in her wedding finery. How impossible it would have seemed then to imagine this life, this love, this family. "I'm here," Zach had promised that day, "and I'm not leaving," and he never had.